What now? Wondered Gregor, and looked around in the dark. He soon made the discovery that he could no longer move. It came as no surprise to him. If anything, it seemed inexplicable that he had been able to get as far as he had on his frail little legs. Otherwise he felt as well as could be expected. He did have pains all over his body, but he felt they were gradually abating, and would finally cease altogether. The rotten apple in his back, and the inflammation all round it, which was entirely coated with a soft dust, he barely felt any more. He thought back on his family with devotion and love. His conviction that he needed to disappear was, if anything, still firmer than his sister's. He remained in this condition of empty and peaceful reflection until the church clock struck 3 a.m. The last thing he saw was the sky gradually lightening outside his window. Then his head involuntarily dropped, and his final breath passed feebly from his nostrils. When the charwoman came early in the morning, so powerful was she, and in such a hurry, that even though she had repeatedly been asked not to, she slammed all the doors so hard that sleep was impossible after her coming. She at first found nothing out of the ordinary when she paid her customary brief call on Gregor. She thought he was lying there immobile on purpose, and was playing at being offended. In her opinion, he was capable of all sorts of understanding. Because she happened to be holding the long broom, she tried to tickle Gregor away from the doorway. When that bore no fruit, she grew irritable, and jabbed Gregor with the broom, and only when she had moved him from the spot without any resistance on his part did she take notice. When she understood what the situation was, her eyes went large and round, she gave a half-involuntary whistle, didn't stay longer, but tore open the door of the bedroom, and loudly called into the darkness, "Have a look! It's gone and perished! It's lying there, and it's perished!" The Samsas sat up in bed and had trouble overcoming their shock at the charwoman's appearance in their room, before even beginning to register the import of what she was saying, but then Mr. and Mrs. Samsa hurriedly climbed out of bed, each on his or her respective side, Mr. Samsa flinging a blanket over his shoulders, Mrs. Samsa coming along just in her nightdress, and so they stepped into Gregor's room. By now the door from the living room had been opened as well, where Greta had slept ever since the tenants had come. She was fully dressed as if she hadn't slept at all, and her pale face seemed to confirm that. "Dead?" said Mrs. Samsa, and looked questioningly up at the charwoman, even though she was in a position to check it all herself, and in fact could have seen it without needing to check. "I should say so," said the charwoman, and by way of proof, with her broom pushed Gregor's body across the floor a ways. Mrs. Samsa moved as though to restrain the broom, but did not do so. "Ah," said Mr. Samsa, "now we can give thanks to God." He crossed himself, and the three women followed his example. Greta, not taking her eye off the body, said, "Look how thin he had become. He had stopped eating such a long time ago. I brought food in and took it out, and it was always untouched." Indeed, Gregor's body was utterly flat and desiccated, only so apparent now that he was no longer up on his little legs, and there was nothing else to distract the eye. "Come in with us a bit, Greta," said Mrs. Samsa with a melancholy smile, and not without turning back to look at the corpse. Greta followed her parents into the bedroom. The charwoman shut the door and opened the window as far as it would go. In spite of the early hour, there was already something sultry in the morning air. It was, after all, the end of March. The three tenants emerged from their room and looked around for their breakfast in outrage. They had been forgotten about. "Where's our breakfast?" the middle gentleman sulkily asked the charwoman. She replied by setting her finger to her lips, and then quickly and silently beckoning the gentleman into Gregor's room. They followed, and with their hands in the pockets of their somewhat shiny little jackets, stood around Gregor's body in the bright sunny room. The door from the bedroom opened, and Mr. Samsa appeared in his uniform, with his wife on one arm and his daughter on the other. All were a little teary. From time to time, Greta pressed her face against her father's arm. "Leave my house at once," said Mr. Samsa, and pointed to the door without relinquishing the women. "How do you mean?" said the middle gentleman, with a little consternation, and smiled a saccharine smile. The other two kept their hands behind their backs and rubbed them together incessantly, as if in the happy expectation of a great scene, which was sure to end well for them. "I mean just exactly what I said," replied Mr. Samsa, and with his two companions walked straight towards the tenant. To begin with, the tenant stood his ground and looked at the floor as if the things in his head were recombining in some new arrangement. "Well, I suppose we'd better go, then," he said, and looked up to Mr. Samsa as if he required authority for this novel humility. Mr. Samsa merely nodded curtly at him with wide eyes. Thereupon the gentleman did indeed swing into the hallway with long strides. His two friends had been listening for a little while, their hands laid to rest, and now skipped after him, as if afraid Mr. Samsa might get to the hallway before them and cut them off from their leader. In the hallway, all three took their hats off the hat stand, pulled their canes out of the umbrella holder, bowed silently, and left the flat. Informed by what turned out to be a wholly unjustified suspicion, Mr. Samsa and his womenfolk stepped out onto the landing. Leaning against the balustrade, they watched the three gentlemen proceeding slowly but evenly down the long flight of stairs, disappearing on each level into a certain twist of the stairwell and emerging a couple of seconds later. The further they descended, the less interest the Samsa family took in their progress, and when a butcher's apprentice passed them and eventually climbed up much higher with his tray on his head, Mr. Samsa and the women left the balustrade altogether, and all turned back with relief into their flat. They decided to use the day to rest and to go for a walk. Not only had they earned a break from work, but they stood in dire need of one. And so they all sat down at the table and wrote 3 separate letters of apology, Mr. Samsa to the board of his bank, Mrs. Samsa to her haberdasher, and Greta to her manager. While they were so engaged, the charwoman came in to say she was leaving, because her morning's tasks were done. The 3 writers at first merely nodded without looking up, and only when the charwoman made no move to leave did they look up in some irritation. "Well," said Mr. Samsa. The charwoman stood smiling in the doorway as though she had some wonderful surprise to tell the family about, but would only do so if asked expressly about it. The almost vertical ostrich feather in her hat, which had annoyed Mr. Samsa the whole time she had been working for them, teetered in every direction. "So, what is it that you want?" asked Mrs. Samsa, who was the person most likely to command respect from the charwoman. "Well," replied the charwoman, and her happy laughter kept her from speaking. "Well, just to say, you don't have to worry about how to get rid of the thing next door. I'll take care of it." Mrs. Samsa and Greta inclined their heads over their letters as if to go on writing. Mr. Samsa, who noticed that the woman was about to embark on a more detailed description of everything, put a hand to cut her off. Being thus debarred from speaking, she remembered the great rush she was in, and, evidently piqued, called out, "Well, so long, everyone," spun round, and left the apartment with a terrible slamming of doors. "I am letting her go this evening," said Mr. Samsa, but got no reply from wife or daughter because the reference to the charwoman seemed to have disturbed their concentration no sooner than it had returned. The 2 women rose, went over to the window, and stayed there, holding one another in an embrace. Mr. Samsa turned towards them in his chair and watched them in silence for a while. Then he called, "Well now, come over here. Leave that old business, and pay a little attention to me." The women came straight away, caressed him, and finished their letters. Then the 3 of them altogether left the flat, which was something they hadn't done for months, and took the tram to the park at the edge of the city. The carriage in which they sat was flooded with warm sunshine. Sitting back comfortably in their seats, they discussed the prospects for the future. It turned out that on closer inspection these were not at all bad, because the work of all of them, which they had yet to talk about properly, was proceeding in a very encouraging way, particularly in regard to future prospects. The greatest alleviation of the situation must be produced by moving house. They would take a smaller, cheaper, but also better situated and more practical apartment than their present one, which Gregor had found for them. While they were talking in these terms, almost at the same time, Mr. and Mrs. Samsa noticed their increasingly lively daughter, the way that of late, in spite of the trouble that had made her cheeks pale, she had bloomed into an attractive and well-built girl. Falling silent and communicating almost unconsciously through glances, they thought it was about time to find a suitable husband for her, and it felt like a confirmation of their new dreams and their fond intentions when, as they reached their destination, their daughter was the first to get up and stretched her nubile young body. End of Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka.